One of my favorite courses, I think I learned it at my first appointment, is called My Lord Knows the Way Through the Wilderness. And I won't sing it for you this time, but it goes, my Lord knows the way through the wilderness. All I have to do is follow. My Lord knows the way through the wilderness. All I have to do is follow. Strength for today is mine all the way, and all that I need for tomorrow. My Lord knows the way through the wilderness. All I have to do is follow. Well, you can see in the background here, you got a pretty little stream flowing along, and a headlamp hanging on the TV, and my hat, I think, you can probably in the picture, and a whole bunch of camping gear behind me. And I love the wilderness, and I love to camp, and we grew up camping, and then my wife and I took our kids camping, and I think they've gained an appreciation for it as well. But the wilderness can be dangerous unless you're prepared for it. And the Israelites weren't very prepared for it as they launched into their new life free from slavery. But the wilderness through which Moses led the Hebrews, now we know it as the Sinai Peninsula. If you look on a map, it looks like a piece of pizza pointing downwards in between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba. And it's a pretty desolate place. It's desert, and it's dry, and it's rocky, and mountainous, and hot. Along the coasts, there are better areas and places where you can find food, particularly fish, and some plant life. But in the center, where the Israelites ended up wandering, is not a place you want to be without a lot of preparation. Now, you can probably drive across it in about 2 hours. North to south, you can drive 4 hours. Even then, if the Israelites had paid attention and been obedient, they could have traveled it in about 2 weeks. But what happened? That 2 weeks turned into 40 years. Recently, we drove twice that distance through the Middle East here. And it is the road we took was through a very hot, very dry area, a lot like the Sinai Peninsula, and not a place that I would want to have a tire go flat or to run out of gas. And so I can just imagine trying to walk through an area like that. Well, no one knows for certain their exact path. We do know that Moses and the Israelite people didn't take either of the faster and easier routes. No, they followed a winding path through the desert, and God came to them to help them find their way through in between the mountains and in and out of the canyons. He led them by a pillar of fire in the nighttime, getting my pillars mixed up, and cloud in the daytime, so they could clearly see where their next steps should take them. It was dangerous. It was dangerous. We're told that there were venomous snakes, not much food and water, and they would stop and complain, even asking to be taken back to the land they were enslaved in, because at least they had food there. Like the people Moses led, we often pray for God's leading and guidance, and we too often cry out and often complain about what we don't have and about what we need or think we need. But we cry out for God to deliver us from our difficult situations. But what happens when that deliverance means that we are led into the wilderness by the long route? How do we survive the wilderness of our faith when we cry out like the people in the book of Numbers, have you brought us here to die? And begin to openly question God's faithfulness, His love, His plan for us. To these questions, Moses did not give any of the usual answers. Hey, toughen up. You call that a wilderness? We're going to be just fine. Things could be worse. Don't worry, relax, we'll be okay. Instead, Moses tells them to remember the wilderness and even embrace the wilderness. Because God led us to this place, and God is the only one who can see beyond the desert to a place which flows with good things, the land of his promise. He knows that that pillar of fire and then that pillar of cloud off in the distance, if they just follow them, are going to take them to the land he has promised them, filled with good things to sustain them. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness. Remember why God leads us into the wilderness. According to Deuteronomy 8, verse 2, part of the reason that God brings us into the wilderness is to humble us. Moses continues in 8:3, he humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. God spoke the manna into existence. It was his word that created and gave these things to the Israelites. Wildernesses are places that we cannot possibly get through on our own. Moses was leading more than 1 million people in a land without the resources to support them. Therefore, they had to rely on God's miraculous provision every moment of every day. They had to know that that night they could find a place to safely sleep. They had to trust that there would be food, or that they would find food as they walked along. Exodus 16 and 17 tells us that God sent manna for the people to make bread, drove quail into the camp for the people to have a little bit of protein, and made water flow from a rock for the people to drink. In this way, God sustained them for 40 years. Can you imagine God, what he's thinking? I showed them where to go. They could have been there in 2 weeks. Yet they took 40 years. I've had to feed these ungrateful people for 40 years when it could have been 2 weeks. The problem is never that God will not or cannot sustain us. The problem is that there's not enough room in our lives for that sustenance and grace from God, and our pride. Eventually, God will lead us to a place where we must choose one or the other. Major Amy Jo and I are real big fans of a show called Alone. And in that show, a group of people get taken out into the wilderness. And they're alone. You know, their contestants might be a few miles, a few kilometers away, but they're alone in their area. And the person that lasts the longest can win, I think it was $1 million. And they have very little supplies. They're allowed a little bit of equipment, but not much. And they have to survive alone. One of the contestants found a place where he could catch fish. And he was catching fish and feasting on fish. And then he started to say, no, I need to save some of these fish in case I really need them, instead of trusting that they would show up when he needed them. So he would smoke them over his fire and dry them so that he could have these fish when he was on death's door. And unfortunately, that happened. Weekly, the producers of this show would send a medical team to take the vitals and to check on each of the contestants to see how they were doing. It wasn't long, it was, I think, before they noticed this one contestant, Dave, getting thinner. And each week as we watched the show, you could see him getting skinnier and skinnier. It turned out that he wasn't eating his food. He was catching all kinds of fish, and he would dry them and hang them. He had little racks he made in the trees, and he would hang these fish there. But he wasn't eating it. He was leaving it there because he didn't trust that there would be more, even though he had lots to get him through. And he was the first contestant in the show's history that was pulled off of the show because when the doctors came and checked on him, he was so emaciated, so thin, he was in danger of starving to death. He had food that could have lasted him weeks, But he was starving himself to death. His body was shutting down from starvation. We starve ourselves. We starve ourselves of God's blessing. We allow ourselves to be spiritually starving. Moses understood that in the land of God's promise, the people would not need to worry about physical hunger as they did in the wilderness. However, they would still face the dangers of spiritual starvation if they did not continue to rely on God every day to sustain them. And we have to rely on God every day to sustain us. If God can sustain 1 million people in an inhospitable wilderness for 40 years, what can he do for us? And you know this verse, Luke 1:27, for with God, nothing is impossible. It doesn't matter what wilderness we are in. God will sustain us emotionally, physically, spiritually. But we need to set aside our pride, our doubts, and trust God. The wilderness is also designed to teach and prepare us for what's ahead. As we in the Salvation Army explore this idea of legacy and sustainability, one of the things we must accept is that we don't know all the challenges that the future holds for the Salvation Army. But we also don't know the blessings that will be ours. Out of the more than 1 million people that Moses led, only 2 of them, Caleb and Joshua, had stepped foot on the land which the people were going to occupy. And that was way back 40 years ago, just when they were starting out on their journey. To be led by God through the wilderness is to accept that we do not know what exactly lies ahead, and to know and believe that God does. To take that one step further, understanding one facet of legacy as the act of remembering and living with the knowledge of that memory is having radical faith in the idea that whatever God is leading me through today will prepare me for tomorrow. Listen to Deuteronomy 8:5. Here is what I want you to know in your hearts. The Lord your God loves you, just as your parents guide their children. How did we learn not to touch a hot stove? Our parents probably allowed us to touch a hot stove, which was hot enough to hurt, but not so hot that we would get scarred or badly hurt. They knew to watch and keep us away from anything dangerous. But I can imagine, I've been burned and played with fire enough to know that it hurts. But, and I don't remember when I first learned that, but I can just imagine little Paul, when Mom was in cooking, coming in and reaching up for the stove to see what she was doing, and her gently pushing me away, and then going, oh, wait a moment. Saying, okay, come over on this side. And me coming around to the other side of her and saying, reaching again. And she knew that that burner had been turned off a minute ago, so it was cooler. And me reaching up and touching that, you go, ow! She knew that no blister would come. She knew that I wasn't going to be badly hurt. But she knew that that would remind me and warn me not to do it again, to keep away from things that were dangerous, to keep away from things that she or my dad said, don't go near that, okay? How did we learn to tell the truth? We were probably punished after being caught in a lie. This is the imagery that Moses is employing. In some ways, childhood is all about learning big, important lessons in small, unimportant ways, and then putting them all together to form us into who we are now. Later in life, when our choices have real meaning and impact, we rely on all of those little lessons piled on each other to guide us. In other words, we could not handle what God has for us today if God had not led us through the wilderness in the past. Difficult wilderness experiences are what God uses to shape us into the people who can occupy the places and ministries that only God can see in our future. We don't know what's coming, but God does. And He knows that the moments in the wilderness are shaping us into who He knows we can be, and who He knows who he wants us to be. When the shepherd boy David had to face a lion and a bear to save his sheep, only God knew that was in preparation for facing down who? Goliath. When young David was out fending off animals with a sling and facing them and growing braver each time he did it, that prepared him for the moment when he faced Goliath. And the stone he dropped into that sling pocket, he knew how to throw it. And he threw it true and killed Goliath. But it was years of experiences and learning that helped him do that. When Catherine Booth was bedridden for many days as a teenager, and her only comfort was reading and studying her Bible, only God knew that one day she would be called upon to defend the Salvation Army's position on alcohol use, on women in ministry, on social justice issues. There is no difficulty that we face which God cannot redeem and use for his glory. Whatever wilderness you find yourself in or have been in, God can and will and has redeemed it. You can look back, and I challenge you to maybe make a little list and think back to things you've gone through and see how God hasn't redeemed those things. Even now, even today, this very moment, the moment that you are hearing my voice, God is preparing us for his glory, just as he was preparing the people whom Moses led for the land of promise. The challenge before us is to humbly believe and trust the places where God is leading. Trust God. He knows where he's taking you.